Alright, Quarantographers, welcome back. We're doing part 2 of reverse engineering light, so we're gonna get right into it. Last time I gave you some very general advice as to how to look at an image and break down where the light's coming from. At the end, I asked you guys for some suggestions as to photos you'd like to see me break down, and I got a couple suggestions, and today I'm going to show you my thoughts on this photo by DePalma. This is a lovely portrait of author Malcolm Gladwell. And as you can see, it's got this ghostly shadow. Now, this is an interesting case for lighting. It's really a mix between a dragged shutter and a strobe photo. So it's kind of two photos in one is how you want to think of it. You've heard me talk before about building from fill upwards. I'm going to reverse engineer the light kind of twice on this one. Once to kind of try and get the ambient light shot, the blurry part of this, and then once with my strobes to build on top of it. So one of the interesting superpowers about strobes is that they freeze motion, and because of that you can kind of use them to drop a second exposure into the same shot. If you have a long enough shutter speed, you could even pop a strobe twice and it'll look kind of like you exposed the image twice and get a double exposure effect. In this case, what's happened is, what Brian's done is he's clicked the shutter, popping the flash, then jerked his camera and let the rest of the exposure run out away from where the first part of the exposure was. So there's kind of two exposures happening here. During the first part, the flash is popping, freezing the motion because it's only on for a microsecond, and then he's turning a little bit and letting the rest of the exposure burn in slowly over the course of a longer exposure. In this case, something around 1/5 of a second. There are a few pitfalls in trying to figure out how this was lit. First of all, it's going to be very difficult for me to do on my own because I can't jerk the camera in the way that Brian likely did in between the flash and the ambient exposure. So what I'm going to do is hit the exposure and then move myself in and try and jerk myself to the side to try and get this smear. It's probably not going to be quite as clean as Brian's shot, but I got there pretty closely. The second thing is, you can kind of tell looking at this that the ambient has a slightly different color to it than the actual exposure. My guess is he was either using the modeling light from his strobe as the ambient, or just whatever was in the room. My thought is leaning away from it being the modeling light. Note how there's no catch light in his eyes. It's actually a slightly more toppy light than the finished image has. And there's also a little bit of a green cast. My bet would be that he was in sort of a fluorescent lit room, maybe an office, that he'd set up a black background in. So given that, I think that the ambient exposure was done via some sort of overhead office fluorescent light, let's break down how the flash image was produced. There's one really big clue here, and that's in his eyes. You can see a very large circular catch light that is fairly uniform in its exposure. It's not, I don't think it's a shoot-through umbrella because you can't see any spokes. There is a line, but I believe that's from his glasses. My guess is that it's from either a large Octave or a Photech soft light or something like that. There seems to be a secondary light source in his eye on the lower right hand there, maybe a fill. Then on the camera left side, you can see on his hair just a kiss of light, letting us know that there's some sort of rim light happening here. You can also see it a little bit on his cheekbone right here. Looking at the nose shadow here, it's not going too far below the nostrils, and that tells me that the light is not too far above him. It's a little toppy, but it's mostly sidey. So with that all said, let's take a look at how I eventually found my way to what I think is a pretty close approximation of this light. Let's go to the studio. So my first thing is to build this giant octabank. It's kind of a pain in the ass, but it can yield a very beautiful light. So in this case, I decided it was worth it. I noticed that the camera was set a little bit below Malcolm's eye line, so I went for a slightly low angle there. There's just making sure all ambient is killed first before I start bringing it back. Setting the shutter speed to 1/5 here, which I think is a pretty good shutter speed for the dragged shutter portion of this photo. And I'm noting the mismatch in light on my face here. You'll notice on the camera left side of my face, it's pretty blue, and on the camera right side, it's pretty orange. And that's because the light above me is tungsten, but the light out the window is daylight. So I'm gonna try and get that all in the same gamut. I have an LED light in that lamp that I can change to different colors, so I've made it daylight balanced. flagging the window light a little bit, trying to make it so that all the light is coming from this overhead. And here I am setting up a negative fill right next to my face, because partially covering that window still wasn't quite enough to get rid of that heavy highlight on the camera left side of my face. Now it's a little bit too dark. So now after color correcting a little bit, I've gotten to what I consider to be a reasonable approximation of the blurry half of the photograph, the right side of the original. It's got a little bit of that green tint to it. It's kind of toppy with the hooded eyes. There are no catch lights. Now I'm setting up the kicker. This is something, an issue I'm running into here. In order to get enough ambient to make this smudge happen, I have to be fairly open on my camera, so all of my flashes are coming through a little too bright. In order to get this kicker where I want it to be, I ended up having to turn it away from me quite a bit. Even turning it all the way to its bottom was still too much light. Now I've turned on the Octave bank, and as you can see, it's also quite a bit brighter than everything else, so I'm turning that way down. This is probably the right exposure area to get the tonality that is coming through in Brian's image. It's quite a bit below technically proper exposure, but in order to get all that nice gradation in the highlights and shadows of the skin tones, sometimes it's better to expose a little bit down. As you see, as I get brighter, you start losing a lot of that detail. And obviously I have a very different skin tone than Malcolm Gladwell, but it's not reading in that glistening way that I'd like it to. Here I'm still not quite happy with the dragged shutter portion of this photo. I noticed it wasn't still getting that kind of green tone from the original, so I changed my LED light back to tungsten, but that's way too orange. So my next experiment was to gel the key and the kicker heavily CTO, so that everything would be in the same tungsten balanced area. My hope was that some subtle balance issue between the CTO and the overhead light would create this green tint. So at this point I'm pretty frustrated just trying to use actual ambient and this overhead daylight, so I've actually brought in this controllable daylight panel, and this really kind of helped out quite a bit. I'm using this for the drag shutter portion of things. It's too weak to show up in the strobe side. I've also come a little closer with the camera to enhance the present feeling you get from the original. Here I'm playing with curves a little bit, trying to keep that nice mid-tone tonality in my skin while still keeping the highlights bright, which requires a fairly strong manual curve. I don't quite get it immediately. After some fiddling in standard curves, I switch over to the Luma curve, which is something only Capture One has. It allows you to modify the contrast curves without touching the chromatic or color curves at all. And this, I find, is having more of this effect. You're starting to see the highlights in my forehead nicely matching up with Malcolm's. So I'm still a little frustrated here by how much more magenta my shutter drag leans than Brian's. So what I've done is I've taken a green gel, a light green gel, and I've covered half of my light panel in that. And that seemed to have got me there. Suddenly, the tonality in my shutter drag is much closer matching that of the original Malcolm Gladwell shot. Now I feel like I've actually gotten to where I need to be. A little bit of color correction later, and I think we're done. So I want to acknowledge that the video contained a lot of color work that you didn't really get to see. So I've brought the final image into Capture One here, and I'm going to color correct it from scratch for you guys so you can see my thought process on this. A few things to note about this image that are not as great about the original. I didn't quite nail focus. That's kind of to be expected considering I was using a remote trigger and didn't have control over focus. However, I do want to take a look here at the eyes and see how fairly similar that catchlight is. It really tells me I did a pretty good job recreating that key. What I'm not seeing is this curved white catchlight. I kind of beefed it on the fill, I think. My guess is he had some sort of narrow strip, which I just don't have in the house, but it's adding a lot of really nice texture to Malcolm's eyes here. that you're not getting as much with me. Once again, focus issues too. First thing I'm gonna do is crop it to the same aspect ratio. I'm pretty sure this is a 5:4. I've spoken before about my love of 4:5. I'll load it up side by side here. Might come up a little bit up the neck. Straight out the gate, I'm gonna note that Brian's image is bluer than mine. So I'm gonna kind of drag our white balance over in that direction. Bluer and greener, less magenta. Good, that's getting us closer to the general zone. Capture One also has this normalize white balance. It's kind of a neat tool, but I'm gonna give it a shot just to see what it does. So I'm picking that skin tone and dropping it to a certain specific similar area. I'm willing to work from that as a starting point. Curious to see what it does if I say exposure as well. Interesting. That actually might be pretty good. From there, I might come down on exposure a little bit. Let's see. What I'm looking for here, let's see. Highlights at 198, 182, average 182. So his highlights are actually a bit bluer than mine. So I'm actually gonna go over here to the three-way color balance and just bring a little bit of blue into those highlights. Go even more. That's more in line. You go a little bit towards green. It's more of a cyan highlight. I'll bring the midtones down back towards the orange again though. So I'm actually dropping exposure again. I really want to see a big difference here between the midtones and the highlights. When it's higher, they kind of blend into each other. But when it's back down lower, you start getting this change, this difference between the two. So now you see the histogram, it's actually quite, you might say, unhealthy. So I'm in the Luma channel here, which means usually when you add a contrast curve in curves, it kind of makes the saturation, it kind of crunches the saturation a little bit. Luma really only affects the lightness channel, and that's what we're after here. I have this kind of unhealthy histogram because I lowered the exposure so much so I could get more distance between the highlights and the midtones. So I want to make it brighter while preserving the relationship between the two. So now that it's down, I'm going to pull this curve up on this linear basis, bring those highlights up, and we're already getting kind of close now. Shadows are a little too bright now, but now the midtones are going away. Lower that shadow point. Raise the midtones. Get rid of some of that extra. There. I like to bring up the shadows and drop the highlights a little bit. Adjust the exposure again. From here I might warm it up a little bit. Green it up. It's looking a little too magenta again. I'm gonna add a little bit of clarity and structure. So from here I'm gonna add some dodging and burning. In Capture One I like to do that with some layers. I set the dodge one to exposure plus, let's say 2, burn to -2. Bring out the eyes a little bit. This is on a very low flow brush. I'm also going to bring up the smudge a little bit, make it look a little bit more present. I'm going to erase the extra highlights on the ear. Just pop some of these highlights more. Might darken now some areas. I feel like I have a little too much clarity on right now. I might just make a separate layer for eyes. I'm gonna fill the whole mask just so I can watch it happen. Paint it in now. Paint it out now. Really just want it on the irises. Feels a little strong. So there you are. Before, after. Thank you so much for dropping in. I hope you learned something. I'd love to see you guys' take on this particular image. If you want to take a crack at it and send me the shots, if you're a member of our Discord, I'd be absolutely happy to give my comments and feedback on it. If you want to try any other image and give me a side-by-side, I'd love to see that. And furthermore, if you want to see me break down any other images, please send them my way. I am looking for inspiration, and this was a tremendous practicing experience. I actually haven't done this exercise for a while, so I'm a little rusty. I hope you learned something. Thank you so much for coming by. Don't forget to like, subscribe. Come on back now. Here, that's Quarantography for today. Until next time, stay safe, stay inside, stay shooting. Thanks so much.